I want to introduce you to the case study method. It's something that's sort of new to journalism. It's more popular in law schools and in business schools. Journalism professors, and I know there are some journalism educators here, and I know some of you went to journalism school. Journalism educators usually don't use the case study method because they have the real world. They could send their students out to City Hall. They could send them to a murder. They could send them to a crime. They don't need to simulate. But the dean at Columbia Journalism a few years ago had this idea that we should have case studies because you want to bring students into the moment, into a decision, and then stop the clock and say, what would you do if you were in a newsroom? What decisions would you make? So at first, this effort was supported by the Knight Foundation, and in recent years, the Knight cut it free, and it's now called the Case Consortium at Columbia. And it serves not only the journalism schools, but some other schools at Columbia who are interested in the case study method. So I'm going to walk you through a case. It's the Bruce Ivins case, and we're going to get to a certain point and stop the clock, and I'm going to ask you, what do we do next? And there's no right or wrong answer. It's not what did the newsroom do, it's what is the right thing to do. What should we do at this point? In some ways, this is going to be a print version of what Al did this morning. I'm not going to have any video clips, but I am going to have some print stories to show you. And rather than go through several of them, I'm going to drill down at one moment. I am going to ask, I bet you all can see me, all right? That light is very bright, and I'm wondering if it could just be dimmed or extinguished, and I'm sure you'll see me even without it. So, what usually happens in a case study is the students are given the case in advance. They're supposed to read it. They're supposed to come to class prepared to have a discussion and prepared to jump right in, and the professor rubs his hands or her hands and says, okay, what do we do? What are the issues involved? What are we confronting? I recognize that there's a lot of reading that you had to do. You're not students. You have other things going on. And rather than distribute the case in advance, I thought I would walk you through the case, and then we'll get to that moment. Then we'll stop the clock and get to that moment. So I'm going to walk you through. Some of this is going to be familiar history to many of you. Some of it will need a little refresher. But I'm going to walk you through a series of events leading up to our moment. So let's go back to 11 years, September 11th, 2001. We all know what happened. Looking around the room, we all lived through it. And it was a time of great trauma in this country, of course. What may not be as well remembered, that in the middle of all this trauma was the Anthrax Scare. It was really just a week after September 11th. It picked up steam in October, but anthrax, this deadly chemical, began to appear in the mailboxes or in the mailrooms of lawmakers and of news organizations. 2 U.S. senators got anthrax in an envelope. NBC News, the New York Post. And this led already a nation that was already in a panic and already in chaos, had to deal with the anthrax scare. This sort of biological weapon seemed like part 2 of 9/11. In those 7 weeks after the anthrax started to appear, 5 people died, mainly postal workers or people dealing with the mail, and 17 became severely ill. The White House announced that the main suspect in the anthrax case is Al-Qaeda, that this is not just domestic terrorism, this is terrorism from abroad. These are the people attacking us. Soon after that, a lot of raids began to happen in Arab communities. In one case, 2 Pakistani brothers were arrested. The FBI went in early in the morning into their homes, and they notified the news media, the news camera rolling, the cameras rolling. They went in and arrested these brothers and a few other people. There was ultimately no evidence against them. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. But these people had been applying for citizenship. Their citizenship efforts were disrupted. They ended up leaving the United States. And those are just a few of the cases of Arab citizens being said to have been the anthrax killers. In 2002, the FBI announced to the news media that they were following Stephen Hatful. Stephen Hatful was a physician and a biological weapons expert for the government, lived outside of Washington, D.C., and worked in a lab called Fort Detrick. He was named as a person of interest, and the media published details about Stephen Hatful, who he was, how he had access to anthrax, how he had perhaps sent these letters, trying to link the anthrax letters and the crime to Stephen Hatful. Well, his career was destroyed, his marriage was destroyed, his livelihood, and it turned out to be a false accusation. Some of you may even remember his name. I mean, you can never clear a name after it's been sullied like that. Just gonna note, the FBI did drop their investigation. 2003, Hatful sues for violation of privacy and later settles with the government for $4.6 million in damages. I tell you all this because it brings us up to the moment of decision. You need to know the history of the anthrax case before we look at the next step. So a lot of effort to find this huge FBI manhunt worldwide. Millions of dollars are spent trying to trace back where this anthrax has come from. In early July 2009, so we're talking many years later, a man named Bruce Ivins, who also worked in the lab at Fort Detrick, another biological weapons expert, kills himself. Does it with an overdose of amphetamines. He kills himself, and the local paper, the Frederick, Maryland News Post, runs an obit of Bruce Ivins. There's no mention of anthrax, and I'll show you that story in a minute, but the important thing is that the FBI was investigating Bruce Ivins. It didn't tell the media. It knew what happened in the earlier cases. It was cautious. There were no leaks. The first time Bruce Ivins' name appears in print is his obituary, and with no connection at first to the anthrax case. Later that same day, the LA Times reveals that the FBI believes it has the anthrax killer, and he is Bruce Ivins. So I'm just going to show you the stories. Here's the story from the Frederick News Post. Bruce Ivins, Dr. Bruce Edward Ivins, 62 of Frederick, died Tuesday, July 29th, 2008, at the Frederick Memorial Hospital. He was the husband of, married 33 years, and if you go down, Dr. Ivins was a wonderful father to his kids, and he was a musician for many years for church services. So this was the local paper covering the obit of Bruce Ivins. Let me tell you a little bit about the Frederick News Post. This is a paper that's been around since 1880. It has a circulation of about 40,000. It's a community newspaper. It comes out 7 days a week. It has a huge penetration in in the county. It is the paper that people read and people identify with. It's owned by the same family since the 1880s. It has deep roots in the community. And they ran this. You'll notice we've been talking a lot about cause of death. There's no mention of a cause of death here. The local paper reports that Bruce Ivins has died. That same day, as you see, this ran July 31st on the website of the Los Angeles Times. This story runs. A top government scientist who helped the FBI analyze samples from the 2001 anthrax attacks has died in Maryland from an apparent suicide, just as the Justice Department was about to file criminal charges against him for the attacks. The Los Angeles Times has learned. National newspaper, different agenda. The Los Angeles Times tells the story of Bruce Ivins, a suicide, and a prime suspect in the anthrax investigation. Needless to say, the local newspaper is scooped. It has to explain why it didn't cover the Ivins story. Why did it miss this big, big story right under its nose? You can imagine at this point, all eyes are on Frederick, Maryland, right? The New York Times shows up, CNN, USA Today, the LA Times. Everyone is suddenly in Frederick trying to find out who is Bruce Ivins. How did this happen? And the competition is ratcheted up. The news posts can no longer ignore this story. So we see what happens in very quick succession. Bruce Ivins dies. The local paper reports his death just as an obituary. The LA Times tells us that he was a suspect. The family of Bruce Ivins announces that it's going to have two memorial services, one at Fort Detrick, where he worked, so that his colleagues can remember him, and that's on August 6th, and a second one on August 9th at the Catholic parish, St. John the Evangelist. The family asks the media not to come to the service. It says, this is a private service. The media cannot come. We're going to bar the media from the service. The question that we ask students to address at that point, and I'm going to ask you to think about, is what does the News Post do? It's already been beaten in its own backyard, right? It's already been beaten by the LA Times on a story about a local citizen and how he's sort of become this national figure and this answer to a lingering question that we've had for most of that decade. What does the News Post do? Does it honor the family's wishes, or does it somehow sneak a reporter into the service? At this point, I'm going to stop the clock and say, and ask you about the competing interests. What would argue for the News Post to send someone, and what would argue against? Anybody? And then I'm actually going to ask you to vote on what you think the right course of action would be. But what are the competing interests here?
Respect for a local family. They try to take the higher ground and not feel they need to not take it as something about them, but respect your family and stay away.
So the paper, what's the main interest here? The family, or the newspaper, or the community?
For me, the
Yeah,
family first, the community second, and their competition as a newspaper, or their feeling slighted or beaten out by another paper is third.
Okay, that seems to go against what Al argued this morning, that our first job is to tell the story, but you would say the family, the sensitivity to the family.
Okay. I've been in this situation, different story obviously, but the exact dilemma that's on the screen. And one of the things that my newsroom took into consideration when we were discussing what to do was we have to live here after this story is over, and we have to keep covering the community. And when other publications or outlets that are national, they leave that when they're done with this, because this is a national story, and in my case it also was. So that's one of the ways we weighed that, is we still live here and we still cover the community. So what is our best decision here, long term, not just in this news story?
And what about the public's right to know? And what about people who also live here who want to know? Are they going to feel that we didn't do our job?
And I'm obviously speaking from experience, different than a theoretical discussion, but we ended up doing is explaining the decision we made, and I won't tell people, I guess, what decision we made. We ended up explaining that in the story.
Uh-huh, okay.
So here's why we chose to take the route we took on this dilemma.
So just be honest with the reader that you made a decision based on
The situation and
situation.
our, our role in the community versus other news outlets' roles, and what that left us with. That way people at least knew why we made the decision, whether they agreed or disagreed.
I want to emphasize this is not a theoretical incident.
Right.
This happened, and this, and the editor's name is David Simon, who's a graduate of the J School, had to make this decision. And his publisher, who was the community guy who had been, the family had owned this paper, was not pressuring him one way or the other. He said, what is right journalistically? That's what I want you to do. So, you got the mic.
I can think of two similar situations too. One, a police officer's death. They allowed reporters to come only if they knew him personally and wanted to be there as a personal friend. Someone told me, go ahead, pretend you were his friend. Well, that goes back to integrity. And if somebody said, well, how did you know him? I would only be able to say professionally. I spoke to him on many stories. So I did not sneak in, nor did I go into a political event when they barred the media and someone in the party said, I'll get you in here, don't worry, just take your ID off. Either all my friends are coming with me, or I'm staying, or I'm not going in either. Maybe I've missed a zillion scoops that way, but I can live with that.
Okay.
In this instance, what's the news value in going to the service? I mean, conceivably it's about anthrax, so to go in there, they're not going to talk about it during a service, so you're going to go and see his family members crying. Not to say that that's not going to add more color or texture to a story, but is it relevant to the story you want to write?
Perhaps it will show another side of him. Maybe it would be a good thing. Maybe the family doesn't realize it, but you're doing them a favor by showing up. The service is going to be at Fort Detrick, where he worked. There's a second service scheduled for his church, but it's in a government building, in a government lab, and they're saying don't go.
But this is still the local paper you're talking about.
Just talking-
This is still the local paper you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, in the end, like, the local paper would probably have a better chance of getting the larger story if the family trusts them, and they'll be sort of screwing themselves by sneaking in and going against the family's wishes in the long run, I would think. They might lose out on the spot news value, but the bigger, more important story, they would probably have a better chance, especially being the fact that they'd still be around after all the national people have moved on.
So they should trust their own judgment rather than the family's judgment? Or they should figure they can get the story anyway?
No, I think that they should. I personally would hold off and try and make inroads with the family later.
Okay. But we run a daily paper. We have to put out a paper for tomorrow. All the competition is hovering around Frederick. They're going to be here.
How many people in Frederick are buying the LA Times?
How many people in Frederick are buying it? Good question.
I mean, within your readership, they're not your competition.
Okay. And David Phillips is a classmate of David Simon who had to make this decision. So it would,
But we haven't spoken about it. I would look for the fudge room anywhere between those black and whites of go and not go. Can I call my friend who knows the wife and say, look, we want to have one person there no camera. We want to make sure that we can accurately reflect this. You know, can we do that? And then maybe make a decision after you find out if that works, and keep trying to make these sort of intermediate steps that hopefully would preserve both your integrity and your relationship. Now, when all that fails, we're still stuck with this, but I would exhaust those possibilities.
So you wouldn't take no for an answer?
No, absolutely no.
You
And,
would see,
and
is there another
ultimately, I
door?
probably would not take no for an answer, period.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm not very experienced in this kind of thing at all, but what occurs to me is, can't you try to find an alternative story to do so that you're not doing no story, but you're doing a story? And if you don't have time yet to do the story about why would the FBI, or trying to exonerate the family in some way, or why would the FBI looking into this, then maybe there's another story that you can do that has to do with the family or the service or something without having to go to the service itself.
So similar to what Dave suggests, I mean, trying to find another way to tell the story, although you're trying to, Dave's suggestion is try to find another way in, try to convince them to let you in. But Al?
I've got a question. We as the local papers still do not have evidence that the FBI was going to do anything, right?
We have the LA Times story.
We have an LA Times story, but we ourselves do not yet know that the FBI was going to do anything. We have another report. We have a report that the FBI was going, possibly, maybe, to do something sometime. We have no paperwork. We have no indictment. We have no criminal charge. We have no arrest warrant. We have no search warrant. We got nothing.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So my question,
The FBI has confirmed. They've confirmed the LA
But they've
Times
done
story.
nothing. They
They have not charged, and we're talking about a man who cannot defend himself.
right. So the
Right?
what I just want to be clear. I want to make sure. I'm trying to ask this as a question. At the moment, we've got no charge. We've got nothing that we can hang our hat on, except that the FBI said we intended to do something sometime pretty soon. And that's a pretty thin thread. That's all I'm saying is I'm hearing a pretty thin thread. And if we show up at these church services, we do a story in a church service, we've added legitimacy to this story. I just want to make sure that I understand this. And can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Who's going to speak at the service?
He left twin sons. His sons are 24 years old. As you saw, he's 62. His sons are 24. His wife is going to speak, and his colleagues are going to talk about him. I mean, on the one hand, you could see another family might say, yeah, come in, see the love for Bruce, see what people felt about him. But this family said, there's this whole media storm. This is a private event. We don't want the press there.
And I want to make sure, this is not a public facility. You would have to get some sort of clearance to get into this.
Yeah.
You said it was in a lab.
It's in it's in a military fort that's part of, it's a government
So
facility.
not only
where
would
the
you be
lab is-
sneaking into a funeral service, you're sneaking onto a federal facility, a military facility. Okay, I just want to be clear about it.
Yeah, but many people are but not everyone there is has a badge or is a relative. There are friends. They've put out the word to his friends, and you could go in as a friend. Yeah, I mean you are sneaking in under a false pretense, but yet you're a member of this community, right? You live and work here. You want to know how is he going to be remembered. Any other considerations?
Well, I agree that sending a reporter isn't the same thing as reporting on it. You could send someone as a member of the community in case something of interest that you determine later is relevant and you would want to have firsthand validation of occurs for your reporting. I think that it seems more about reporting anything on the funeral than sending someone. The intervention point. So, I mean, if I was the editor, just knowing what we know here, I would send someone, but not necessarily with the intention to report just on it, unless something of interest happened.
So you're saying there's another way to cover this memorial from the outside?
Yeah, well, no, I'm saying to send someone, but the dilemma seems less about sending someone than, what you would report. It'd be the reporting that seems like right now would be against the family's wishes. You really can't, it's not really in the family's perspective, it's not up to them if a member of the community who is a reporter with an interest in the community attends. It's more a matter of what's reported and how in the context than later that you use anything. You might send someone and nothing of interest happens that's relevant to the larger story and you don't use it. It seems more about the reporting than the sending a reporter.
You can't do the reporting without sending someone.
Right, so you need to have it
So-
covered in case. You want to be there in case anything happens.
All right. Yes.
So I'm going to continue that argument that there might be a larger story, and part of that story might get told particularly by the research colleagues. Now, if his work as a research scientist was published and in journals, in peer-reviewed journals, you do have another database of this man's commitment to his science. But because it's a military research lab, a lot of it might be deeply hidden. And I would think part of the argument that's going to be made is about this man's capability as a research scientist and his ability to make scientific discovery and decisions. So that's why I would send someone.
And will that illuminate his complicity in this crime? Will that, if we know more about him as a scientist, will we know he was capable of making anthrax, of sending anthrax, of having access to anthrax?
Yes, and
Yeah, okay.
I think we might
So
know a motivation.
So you're saying there's a compelling interest on the part of the public to have someone there, even against the family's wishes. Okay. Do we already know those things, or do we need someone in the room at that moment? So that's okay. Well, I think we've framed the issues pretty well about whether, what the editor has to decide. I've titled this "Public Death," and his death has become a national story, and private grief. The family wants to grieve alone. The family isn't saying, he's innocent, don't come in. The family's just saying this is private. This is not for the press. And the local paper has to make a decision. I'm going to ask you to vote in a moment, but first, I hope I explained the issues involved, and I just wonder if there are any things in the timeline or elsewhere that I didn't explain well.
I guess I just have a question about, so what would be the best case scenario as far as what kind of information would come out of an event like this about the story? What would people hope they would find, or what would be the ultimately?
What could you learn? And that's exactly what the editor has to grapple with. What am I going to get if I send someone that I couldn't get by talking to people in his lab or talking to people in his neighborhood? What am I going to get? But you're very asking that question. It seems to imply that they're not going to get anything more.
No,
Or
I'm just
you
literally
don't know.
wondering. What people think would be the best case scenario of that. Of if you did send a reporter, what would you most want to find or find out? Is that
Right. What would be gained? And of course, you don't know because the memorial service hasn't happened yet. So we don't know what we would get. I'm sorry, I'll just let Al.
I think I remember about him that might be interesting to us. One is that he was awarded 6 years earlier the single highest civilian award that could be given to a civilian by the military for his service in investigating the anthrax attacks. So he essentially had investigated Hatful. He was more or less the scientist who was in charge of the investigation of the anthrax and had received very high decorations for that. In fact, I think it was televised. I think there was actually C-SPAN video of that. And the second thing is he had known for almost a year that he was under investigation, which seemed important as we think about whether he was a higher profile person than just some quiet little scientist.
Right, okay. I'll tell you one other fact, since Bruce revealed those, and then we'll take your question, Michael. The other fact was that the papers found out that his psychiatrist, and he had been seeing a psychiatrist, had out an order of protection against Bruce Ivins. It was, the paper knew it at this point. It had not been published. But his psychiatrist deemed him a danger, not to himself, but to the psychiatrist. The News Post knew this. As you can see, they're treading
He was
lightly on
dangerous
this.
not to himself, but to his therapist.
The therapist felt that he could harm him, that there was a certain violent streak about him. So, I'm sorry, but Michael.
I think her point was a good one. What are you going to get out of a memorial service? I mean, the editor in me is fantasizing about it, and the fantasy goes like this: somebody breaks down and says he did it, and God forgive him, right? Other than that, who knows what you're going to get? You've got a list of sources, probably somewhere, from a program or whatever, who's going to be there. You can go outside the gates of these places, which are probably buzzing with national media who've been told the same thing. And that's a great place to just start digging for more information. And then what you just said is that's the story they should be working on, the order of protection story.
Okay, we're working on that story, but we don't have it
Okay.
nailed down yet. And I'm not ready to go with it in print tomorrow. Tomorrow, I need to cover the service or not cover the service. What do I do? Yeah.
Given these new facts and the order of protection, all I'm seeing is a really lurid story where the News Post goes in and talks about how everybody loved him so much and cries over his death. And here there was this order of protection, and he's went around killing people, and it's becoming really lurid and a nasty kind of journalism that I wouldn't want to be involved with. And so I would vote to not send someone.
If we were to avoid all lurid stories, we'd be kind of, there wouldn't be much in the paper. But
I guess that's what I was trying to get at, is like the fantasies. What, not saying, I wasn't trying to make a comment, but more, what, because I'm just having trouble thinking what exactly would those, best kinds of facts or information be that you would get out of this.
yeah. The fantasy is what, perhaps will just increase the dissonance, right? The loving father, the family man, the church man, and this charge. So again, I don't think it's a bad thing for the family, but this is the family's wish. You could even argue that the best thing would be to have someone inside covering this. That it's going to be, the family doesn't know it. How many times have we talked to people and say, this is a chance for you to tell the story of your son. This is the one day your son is going to be in the papers, as Jesse Green said this morning. People are going to see your son's picture. People are going to know about the good side of Bruce Hatful before the investigation commences, before the FBI begins to release the records that show he is perhaps the Anthrax killer. No.
Well, first of all, I must say that I've covered many services, unfortunately, in Israel, and nothing like that, of course. And I just wanted to mention, to offer something. It's not like I would do it, but following what Dave said, if we get to that point where we ask the family to have someone from our channel newspaper come there, and the family says no, but we still want the information from that service, because you can never know if something interesting happens there. You want to have the information because it's interesting, and I'm sorry, we're still journalists. So I'm not sure if I would do it, but you can always, you have the circle of people that are not the family, but friends or relatives, and if something happens in the service and you weren't there, you can always afterwards interview them and not mention their names. I know it's being very sneaky, or you can even ask some of them to have their phones on with their cameras on, and they will take that video without the family knowing. I know it sounds very bad. I'm not saying I would do it, but this is something that has happened. And
Someone did it to Mitt Romney. Right.
yes, and I mean, it's very sad, but it happens. And if anything happens, and it's very interesting, and it's. I'm talking only about the quality of news there. I know it's very mean, and I would never do it, but journalists do that, and then you have a story.
So you're saying there's another way to cover it without getting your man inside. But
yeah.
this is the choice.
I'm not saying it's a good way to do it, but
Yeah.
journalists do it, and
Journalists do it.
newspapers
Okay,
do it, and
okay.
TV channels do it.
We have a chance, though, to step into this moment and to give David Simon, the editor, some advice. And the two choices are go in, send your reporter and say, somehow sneak in. Pretend you belong, pretend you're a friend, dress differently, pretend you're a friend of his son, somehow get in, sneak in, or don't do the story, stand outside, do it later. We can do a profile of him at another time. So the question is, do we honor the family's wishes and stay out, or do we try somehow to tell our reporter, get inside? You ready to vote? Okay. So all those who think that we should honor the family's wishes. Oh, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's almost everyone. And how many think we should sneak inside? All right. 3. All right. I guess you want to know what David Simon did. He didn't get a reporter inside. He honored the family's wishes. And he, like some of you said when we were talking about this, they are there for the long haul. They're going to stay in the community. They have to answer to people in the community. They're worried about their base. They're not worried about other papers. However, look what happened. The Washington Post, and the next day, coworkers praise Ivins as a top researcher, mentor to young scientists. Bruce Ivins was the type of colleague who would leave packages of M&Ms on the desks of his frazzled boss. He was a survivor junkie who loved deconstructing the latest episode at work. He was known for his groundbreaking development of a new generation vaccines for anthrax, but he also kept a flatulence machine in his office that he mischievously operated by remote control. On the same day, as I think just something's missing here, but on the same day that the service happened, the FBI released hundreds of pages of chilling investigative documents to support its conclusion that Ivins was responsible for the anthrax attacks of 2001 that killed 5 people, a starkly different version of the scientist that was remembered and celebrated yesterday at a private memorial service at Fort Detrick, the Army base in Frederick where he worked. Scooped again. So, see the reporter Ann Hull got into the service somehow. She posed as a friend. She got into the service and brings you the voices from inside. She tells the story of this dissonance between the wonderful colleague, the wonderful scientist, and the center of the FBI investigation. The Washington Post, and I didn't ask you what the Washington Post should do. The Washington Post obviously made a different decision. Yeah, the Washington Post said, damn the community, perhaps, or we don't care. We don't have to worry about our circulation there, or we don't have to worry about our friends there. We don't have to worry about our sources there. We want to be in that service because he is a man of compelling public interest. Let's get into the service. However, the Frederick News Post begins to look, I don't know, does it look like a news organization still? It had this really big story right under its nose. It has to come to terms with the fact that it didn't cover a story that a major news outlet covered. They wrote nothing the next day. They honored the family's wish. Now, they didn't take your advice, which was find another way, stand outside, but they were very cautious. They decided not to go for the quick hit, but to think of the long term. And the family didn't want this memorial service covered. And I suppose the family's wish was hands off the memorial service. Yeah.
A lot of that outside.
Uh-huh.
Someone who was inside shows you the program. They may even let you see the foyer before the service begins. Until I got to that place where the two soldiers are talking in the pew, I'm so angry, that I didn't realize that she was actually in there until I saw that.
So no, she was definitely in there. She didn't do it just by talking to people coming out. But I'm going to throw one other question at you. And notice, the family of Bruce Ivins announces 2 memorial services, one at Fort Detrick on August 6th, which now we see the Washington Post covered and the News Post stayed home for, and a second on August 9th at the Catholic parish, St. John the Evangelist. David Simon now has the decision to make all over again. I got scooped twice. First, the LA Times says that the guy I wrote this simple obituary about is the anthrax killer. Then the Washington Post comes into my turf and shows that that I can't cover news right under my nose. Am I going to get scooped a third time? Yes? So in other words, so if you have integrity, so you're saying, so yes, so if you believe the family's wishes have to be honored, you want to be consistent.
Yeah, but after a month, you will get the good story because the family will come up to you and they will say you were respectful. We're going to give you the good story and you're going to get that interview that no one else got because you respected the family. So
Okay.
I
So
think it
stay-
makes
so
sense.
you're saying
and there's no
honor the
point
fa-
again.
don't go to
this
the
is-
church.
No, because and also, I mean, okay, so you'll cover that service. What are you going to get? What's going to be the story?
Yeah. The Washington Post story was pretty damn good. Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Whoever's got.
but
Sorry, you got
what-
the mic. Sorry.
What if the family don't come to you with a story? Like maybe they just don't want any media at all, and so basically you've painted this very one-dimensional picture of this guy, and you're getting scooped around. The information's out there. Why not take the information that exists out there, and then build it from that, rather than building this trust, which is important, but you've got no idea whether the family will come to you at all.
So the family, you're saying that the family doesn't want any. What if the family says, "I don't want any coverage. Don't write about me"? I mean,
Yeah, pretty much, because they've respected
well,
their wishes so
they cannot
far.
control anything except their memorial service, right? They're saying we're going to have someone at the door checking everybody, and somehow Ann Hull from the Washington Post slips in.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you saying? In other words, so if the family, in other words, damn the family?
No, not at all.
You're changing your vote.
No. What I'm saying is basically, if you're doing this a decision to kind of build trust with this family, to kind of work with you at a bigger piece later down the track, if the family don't want to talk to you 2 weeks, 4 weeks down the track, then what is the purpose of building this trust? Just a question rather than a statement, more really.
And I'm sorry, I just didn't hear your last question. It was, what is the family?
Oh, sorry, what's the point of building this trust with the family if you're kind of building it for the purpose of this story, if you've got no guarantee from them that they're going to work with you on a story?
Right. It's not like they're saying, well, honor this request and we'll talk to you later. We're just hoping that that goodwill will translate into access later. But we don't know that.
What you do know is that the family still doesn't want you there, and that the service story has already been told. So what are you going to get out of going 3 days later? Now you've been scooped twice,
Okay,
and
great.
you'll
What are
be
you going to
3
get
days
3
late.
days later? If you'll notice, the day that the memorial service was held, the FBI released the
Released the
documents.
records, right.
Right?
And
So
why
now
not-
everybody knows. Now he's no longer this innocent who cannot defend himself anymore. Now he is the prime suspect of an FBI investigation. The story has shifted in a couple of days. From the time of the first memorial service to the second memorial service, the story's been ratcheted up.
But if we're focused on scoops, you still have the information that nobody else has about the order of protection, which should be a public record, which you should have been able to get out by now. So
Right,
now your
right.
count is a little less than 0 for 3, or whatever it was.
Right.
So I just would ask, what are you going to get? You're still going to get the same. I feel like you still get the same story that the Washington Post got. He was a great guy because the people who are going to memorialize him are going to be of that opinion, or they wouldn't be speaking
Right.
at the funeral. So I just think the question is, what does it add? Are you going to get anything with the addition of those
Okay, so-
documents? Does the service add anything?
Any other thoughts about the second memorial service and what to do?
I'm wondering, first thought going through my head is I'm wondering how they feel about him now, after seeing the documents. What happened to that first memorial may well be very different at the second memorial.
Right.
Does anyone show up? Those are lots of questions. And if they fail to send a reporter at least to the outside to see who shows up, then they should definitely do it this time. So, I mean, at least there at the doorstep. But you've got 3 days now to work on it. 3 days to do what Dave was saying, try to convince your way to come in the door, and use that leverage to get in the door, that you didn't
Right.
show up at the first one, that you waited for the documents, that you were careful and cautious. But it's a new story now, as you were saying.
So it seems that the story has shifted a little bit. I wonder if any of your votes have shifted. I'll tell you what they do. For the second service, does anybody feel any differently? How many of you think that they should honor the family's wishes as they did the first time? Okay. And how many of you feel they should, this is the time to get a reporter in? Pick up any votes here? Oh, good. We picked up, keep your hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. I guess you're wondering what the News Post did. That's the Washington Post. Oh, wait, we have that story somewhere. Let's build the suspense. How do I go? Oh, wait, yes. There was one other story. What's it? Post story. Well, I didn't copy that one. However, what they did with the second story is that they had someone outside of the church service, and they told the story secondhand. So they still honored the family's wish, but they reported on the memorial service by standing outside and by telling the what was said secondhand, rather than again, as a community newspaper, they honored the family's wish and they stayed out.
Do you know, since you're doing the case study, do you know why they didn't do that the first time, stand outside of the service?
I don't know exactly why. I think they felt that the family was still in shock, that that all they had at that point were was the LA Times story. They had no corroboration from the FBI, which came later, and they decided to stay away from the story. They did report that he was under investigation, but the memorial service itself, they honored the family's wish. And I do think here we see the sort of the tension between a local paper and a national paper and the different agenda. And when you're invested in a community, when you've got to face your readers another day, you're going to make different decisions than if you're just in, for one day or for one story to make a point. Yeah.
That ran about that same, the second funeral?
At the second memorial service,
Second memorial service.
the Washington Post did not cover that. They felt they had done it already.
Okay.
But what's interesting to me is that the News Post sort of learned enough to cover the story from the outside, but not to go in. That as I think as Noah said before, they honored the family's wish, and they were consistent in that. Yeah.
So I think the question we were given maybe needed one more alternative, since we were suggested to get 3 alternatives. The third one would be get the story, work around the family, be outside. We often have to work around sources who won't, or subjects who won't talk to us. So probably the options should be honor the family's wishes, find the story another way, even though they don't want you to write anything, or third, sneak in. So maybe there's a...
Yeah, and we see they exercise that third option at the very end. And I am sorry I didn't get that final slide, but you could look it up and see how the News Post covered it from the outside. And that this is not to say that they didn't work and cover the story thoroughly. If you go on their website, you can see they did extensive reporting about Bruce Ivins, that ultimately they have the stronger report, that they did go back to the family, that they had, they stayed with the story much longer than anyone else did. And perhaps their sensitivity to the family paid off. In the moment, they decided to honor the family. And for them, that was a principle that they stuck to. Yeah.
I just have a question regarding this. What is your view about the American media regarding these situations? Do they usually go with the families or go with the sensitive side? Or would they do what the Washington Post did, which actually, if you ask me, gave them nothing because, okay, there was someone in there, but, okay, so they did the story with what the FBI released. Even if they weren't in the service, they would have the story about the FBI. What is your view about that? Do you think that most of the newspapers and TV channels in the States are like that, or they're more sensitive?
I think
with
what
these
makes
cases?
this a good case study is precisely that it goes against the trend. That, yes, papers will go to any length to get the story. They will intrude on people. They will stick microphones in people's faces. They'll go where they're not supposed to, whether they have cameras or they have hidden cameras. That the general culture, I think, in American journalism is to push forward and to be in your face. What's great about this case study, I think, is that it shows that restraint is sometimes called for, and perhaps sometimes it's the better option. What did the Washington Post get by violating the family, except the enmity and the anger of the family? So,
And they're also hurting the whole, because that family probably does not remember that it was the Washington Post, and next time they're going to be dealing with journalists, I don't know why or for what, they're going to be mad at those journalists, even if they're not from the Washington Post, because they know that those mean journalists are just want to hurt them.
Right.
So
I will say, just in closing, that the nightmare was not over for that family that day. That the FBI later concluded definitively that Bruce Ivins was the anthrax killer, and that is the final conclusion of the investigation. There are people who believe that he did not commit suicide, that he was killed somehow by the FBI, who wanted to get at him and wanted to have their victim and solve the crime. And there are people who believe that it was someone else. The family still believes that it's someone else. But if you look at the definitive answer of who was the anthrax killer, according to our government, is Bruce Ivins. And as I said, Steve Hatfill brought a case against the government a year earlier and was exonerated fully, even though his life was ruined, but was awarded several $1 million in a settlement. So I hope that's a good look at this issue of public death, private grief, making a decision on suicide. I think I'm out of time, but I'm sure we'll have time for your question later. Thank you. Yeah.
That was terrific, not only in capturing the essential dilemma that all of us face sooner or later when confronted with a public suicide and the conflict over family wishes. It also reminds me very much of the tension that comes up over and over again between local and national media when reporting any community tragedy. Virginia Tech, which was, after all, a suicide at the end of it, but also any other kind of what starts as a local story and then becomes national. Very often the national press will come in and violate family wishes or engage in other more intrusive practices that then blow, as far as local reporters are concerned, years of careful relationship building. So this is a very real and important case.